morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Ekwa, Professor Schick, Dean, Mr. Gershowitz. I feel very humbled and honoured to be asked to open this august gathering. It couldn't be a more apt time to be talking about truth and its relationship to peace. It's the 9th of November 2018. I know that because tomorrow is my birthday. It also happens to be 3 days after a very contentious midterm election here in the United States. In 2 days it will be 100 years since the armistice of the First World War. Two concepts that I believe are intimately intertwined. And so I wanted to speak to you this morning about the relationship between those concepts, and I've entitled my talk with you this morning, All the World's a Stage. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. And one man in his time plays many parts. Those, some of you will know, are the famous words of the melancholy commentator Jacques that crosses the paths of the protagonist in Act 2 of Shakespeare's As You Like It. And for much of our history, that idea that all the world's a stage has rung true. True in the sense that a play is true. True in the sense that a metaphor is true. Not literally true. Not anymore. Gone are the days when our life quota of 15 minutes of fame was doled out by a begrudging monopoly, or oligopoly I should say, of broadcast networks and print media giants. Today, smartphones, Twitter feeds, Facebook Live and Insta streaming have democratized the information sphere, turning us all into potential stars of our continuous live-streamed melodramas. The world is literally now our stage, and in fact our audience too. We're all players, curating our brands, optimizing our narratives and our reach, playing our many parts in real time. The result is not, alas, a democratic flourishing of the dramatic arts. Rather, I would say we face a fundamental transformation in the role of information in global affairs. And it's to that transformation that I want to speak today. It's changing the role of information brokers and fact finders everywhere, from the mainstream media to UN human rights inquiries. It's transforming attitudes to truth, to scientific expertise, even to evidence-based policymaking and rational political discourse. I think we face a fundamental change in our social relationship to truth, a change that begs questions for all of us. Information is increasingly easy to create, to fake, to find, and to share. And as it becomes so, the line between narrative and truth, between fact and fiction, is breaking down. The role of expert information brokers, including the media, is in curating our shared narratives and constructing national and global political and social discourse. That role is being diluted, forced to compete with individual influencers, with social media platforms, PR companies, global brands, and increasingly, indeed, states that are weaponizing information. Now, don't expect this lowering of barriers to the market for information to reverse anytime soon. Right now, we largely choose when the cameras on our phones and our devices get turned on and off. We choose when we are behaving privately offline and when we are instead prepared to submit to the watching gaze of Google or the tracking cookies of Facebook online. Slowly but steadily, however, we are giving up that choice. Soon the online-offline distinction will be meaningless. The Internet of Things will mean you are constantly on stage. It won't just be that every movement you take will be tracked by that tracking device in your pocket, your smartphone. It will be that there are tracking devices everywhere. Already in many homes today, conversations, singing in the shower, and what in the theatre they used to politely call noises off are being monitored and deciphered by that friendly home assistant, Alexa. Soon, your food consumption will be noted by your refrigerator and relayed to Amazon so that you never have to ask, "Got milk?" again. And as we begin to digitize our biodata and wire our bodies, the new cyber panopticon's gaze won't halt at your skin. It will hear your heartbeat from your Fitbit, smell your stress levels on your breath, and may even let your insurance company know that you're pregnant before you know it yourself. Increasingly, we won't be players on the stage so much as data points on a canvas being constantly scrutinized and interpreted by the algorithms of artificial intelligence. And AI won't just be reading our every move, it's already writing the scripts that we act out. Our paths from A to B. How many of you used Google Maps to find your way here this morning? The recommendations in our Netflix and Spotify accounts. The potential love matches on Tinder. Swipe right, not swipe left. The books recommended for our children. Coming soon, suggestions on your Facebook feed that you reach out to that friend who's been posting melancholy tweets unknown to you. Refusals of insurance based on your Fitbit readings. And already in China, refusal of access to public services because of your low social credit score. All too soon, we won't even be able to tell which players are human and which are robots. If you thought that Twitter bots wreaked havoc on the last US presidential elections, wait for the next ones. When deep fakes, the term used to describe artificial intelligence generated video and audio that is indistinguishable from the so-called real thing, will trigger numerous scandals of politicians being seen to do or say things on video or on audio. Yesterday, in fact, China's national news broadcaster introduced the first artificial intelligence news anchor using exactly this technology. Algorithms, not media professionals, are increasingly the brokers in this market for information. The internet and search have made finding information almost costless. Global digital social networks have done the same for spreading it, and soon AI will have the same impact for faking it. Now, the result, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are losing touch. First, we're losing touch with each other. One of the central business models emerging around AI is based on algorithms that specialize in recommendations. These algorithms essentially work by matching your behavior to the behavior of other people, users, or consumers that appear to be like you. This generates what is sometimes called the filter bubble effect, a filtering process that over time can become self-reinforcing, separating people off into distinct information tracks. Filter bubbles respond to and tend to reinforce our underlying preferences, our assumptions and our prejudices. They polarize us. They narrow the number of forks in life's decisions that we get exposed to. They narrow our social circle. Frankly, they narrow our minds. This leads to a second result, losing touch not just with each other, but with reality itself. Recent social science makes clear that the process of media polarization goes hand in hand with the rise of so-called fake news. The new information economy rewards content providers that can attract and maintain your attention. Nuanced, careful, and balanced reporting and storytelling is not always the easiest or best way to do that. Emotional, strident, even shocking storytelling is the great way to achieve that, especially if your yardstick is viewers, clicks, or retweets. This started, of course, before the emergence of social media. Witness the rise of shock jocks in the 1990s. But the democratization of access to the broadcast system has fueled the arms race. It has saturated us all in outrage. It has become harder to shock us, to attract and maintain our attention. Increasingly, we don't find the truth surprising, let alone shocking. So fake news steps into that gap in the market to shock and outrage us, to attract our attention, our clicks, and our retweets. After all, if the business model externalizes the social costs of rumour mongering, why not peddle in scandal? And if the law immunizes the social media platforms through which rumours, hate speech, and outright lies are spread, who can actually be held responsible? Surrounded everywhere at all times by such a deluge of suspect information, is it any wonder that trust in the media is collapsing? An Axios poll released in June found that 72% of Americans believe that traditional major news sources report news that they know to be fake, false, or purposely misleading. 72%. But the problem isn't just about the media, it's about everyone's social relationship with the truth. Truth seekers and fact finders of all kinds are suspect these days. Think tanks are suspected of being mercenaries, advocates for hire. Climate scientists are suspected of being partisan agenda pushers. And Supreme Court judicial candidates openly tout their partisan credentials rather than their objectivity. That is the environment that Oxford English Dictionary was referring to when it chose for its 2016 Word of the Year, post-truth. The truth, ladies and gentlemen, is that truths are not self-evident. They are, as the celebrated philosopher of science, anthropologist, and founder of actor network theory, Bruno Latour, has argued, they are socially constructed, generated through the network interaction of human and non-human actors. Now, I say this with great care because, like Gabriel, I had a father who was steeped in the truth and to whom I look up. My father was a natural scientist, a fellow of the Royal Society and the Institute of Physics, and president for several years of the International Federation of Societies for Microscopy. I grew up in a home steeped in empiricism, a home in which objective realism, in the epistemological sense, was a guiding and dominant force. But also as a result, like Bruno Latour, whose breakout work was Laboratory Life, the social construction of scientific facts, I spent my fair share of time as an ingenue observer of the life of scientific laboratories. There aren't many kids for whom Take Your Kids to Work Day means peering down the binocular eyepieces of an electron microscope to see 70 carbon atoms arranged in a newly discovered molecular structure, or watching as a vat of liquid nitrogen bubbles on contact with the air. So in saying that I agree with Bruno Latour that scientific facts are socially constructed, I'm not saying that there is no objective reality. Like Scully and Mulder from the X-Files, I believe that the truth is out there. The question is what it means to know the truth. Now, at the height of the debate over Latour's views that the truth is socially constructed, Alan Sokal, another physicist, who believed that Latour was saying that the laws of physics are actually just social conventions, invited Latour to jump out the window of his 21st floor apartment. Probably smartly, Mr. Latour refrained. It wasn't, you see, that he didn't believe the law of gravity to be real, or gravity to be real. Rather, he was saying that the law of gravity, as we know it, is something that has emerged from social enterprise, from socially constructed institutions and relationships. That is, after all, what laws are, social institutions, even if they enshrine and reflect an underlying physical truth. The most important place in my father's laboratory, you see, wasn't the room with the multi-million-dollar microscopes, with the vats of liquid nitrogen, or even, frankly, the director's office, his office. I think if you asked my father, he would have said that the most important room in the laboratory was the tea room. Because it was the tea room where the social bonds that form the basis of the scientific enterprise were forged and maintained. Scientists might not stereotypically be thought of as party animals, but they are most decidedly social animals. Because the scientific method, with its fundamental emphasis on falsifiability, demands that. Your experimental results are just that, results, unless and until they are falsified by someone else, someone independent. Only then are they on their way to becoming knowledge, or what we would colloquially call facts. Science is a social enterprise through which, over hundreds of years of standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before us, we have slowly, through steady accretion, and occasionally through sudden Kuhnian paradigm shifts, leapt forward, deepening our collective understanding of the truths of the universe that has given rise to us. The truths that scientists slowly map and describe exist independently outside the human mind. But facts, that is something else. They are a social depiction of that underlying objective reality, cast on the walls of the Platonic cave. It was the transnational social enterprise of science in early modern Europe that unleashed the Enlightenment, that unleashed the powers of the Industrial Revolution and modern medicine. That international society has helped us better make sense of those flickering shadows cast on the walls, through which we come to know the truth. And that method, the scientific method, has changed our lives immeasurably for the better, doubling life expectancies, decimating poverty, and all but exterminating the greatest illnesses known to humankind. Now, what that tells us all, ladies and gentlemen, is that knowledge is a social artifact. And that means that facts cannot survive on their own. They are the fruits of a tree of knowledge, a set of institutions and social networks and ways of relating to the world that must be tended and protected. As Rush Holt Jr., a physicist who served 16 years in Congress, recently put it, we need to defend the conditions in which science can thrive. If we don't tend to the institutions that support facts, if we allow their authority and expertise to wither and die, so will the facts as we know them, and all the edifices and artifices we construct upon them. But instead of carefully tending the fragile tree of knowledge, we see attacks on it. Around the world, politicians are hacking at the limbs and boughs of the tree of knowledge. Politicians are turning away from evidence and reason-based policy to the visceral, the emotional, to the tide of affect and the populist waves of innuendo, rumour, and conspiracy. Waves that they can ride to power at the ballot box. Science and the free media, with their shared rationalist foundations, their shared conception that there is such a thing as truth, science and the free media stand in the way of that raw populist power. So politicians undermine them, not only through the glacial action of drip-fed cynicism, but through increasingly overt attacks. This is the path that has led us not just to offhand dismissals of the science of climate change and here at the UN, the medical evidence on breastfeeding, but to labelling the media as the enemy of the people. This is the path that leads to bone saws in consulates, that leads to a pipe bomb in a broadcaster's mailroom, and to rape and murder of investigative reporters in a forest in Bulgaria. This is the path that, according to the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, has led to a doubling of the average number of journalists killed worldwide in the last decade. Now, I'm an employee of the United Nations. So where is the United Nations in all of this? Well, the UN Charter is a fundamentally rationalist document. It's built on Enlightenment-based assumptions, envisaging states cooperating in good faith based on shared scientific understandings of how the world actually is. And rights of free speech, conscience, opinion, and a free media are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN is an ardent advocate of the protection of journalists, and UN fact-finding processes are central to the pacific resolution of interstate disputes and the development of scientific consensus underlying global public policy responses to a host of shared problems, from global disease to poverty to climate change. But the transformations in the information sphere that I described at the beginning of these remarks are affecting all of that. Manipulation of the information sphere offers states a way to work directly on the will of the citizens of their adversaries, acting directly on their hearts and minds without the need for expensive and complex instruments such as bombs, tanks, or infantry to induce that change of hearts and minds. So as manipulation of the information sphere becomes increasingly central to geostrategy, UN bodies are rapidly turning into arenas for states to promote their own competing versions of reality itself. Now, one byproduct of this shift is that the description of the UN as the world stage is becoming increasingly literal. We all know the General Assembly's high-level week in September, even if only through the terrible impact it has on New York traffic. That annual diplomatic jamboree of set-piece speech-making and diplomatic speed dating is increasingly turning from deals to selfies. The theatrics that were always there, always part of that mix, are becoming increasingly professionalized. The trickle of Hollywood stars to the UN, which began with Angelina Jolie and her dedicated work on refugees, has grown to a flood. The likes of Daniel Craig, Kate Blanchett, Anne Hathaway, Nicole Kidman, and Emma Watson have all been enlisted to deliver tough love messages on specific causes to the goggle-eyed diplomatic groupies at the UN. Nor is this just an Anglophone affair. The French have always been pioneers of the cinematic arts. This year they took a new path when the French delegation released a short film documenting its own efforts to prepare for the General Assembly, featuring the French ambassador as the heroic protagonist striding about decisively in the halls of the UN while his team formed a Republican Guard phalanx marching behind him. All of this should alert us to the impact that the structural changes in the information sphere are having on global public policy discourse. Henry Kissinger recently pointed out in an important article in The Atlantic that digital media encourages leaders to focus less on consensus building and more on responding narrowly to special interests and grievances. The rise of social media at the UN and selfie culture in other gatherings of world leaders suggests something similar is afoot on the world stage, with a growing focus on using summits to pitch to domestic audiences, not to engage and persuade the leaders of other countries. The danger is that the UN itself is becoming a sort of giant filter bubble, with leaders more interested in using the Security Council as an echo chamber to amplify messages directed to their own established followers rather than to find common ground with other states to solve our shared problems. And in this fiction-forward environment, the truth becomes an early casualty in a battle for narrative dominance. Take a recent debate on truly one of the most grave situations confronting the Security Council, the use of chemical weapons in Syria. In that debate, representatives of Russia and the UK traded references to Alice in Wonderland, Sherlock Holmes, and the Midsummer Murders. The gap between the gravity of the facts they were discussing and the triviality of the rhetoric is stark. More broadly, fact-finding is under intense pressure across the UN, from the politicisation of appointments of independent sanctions monitoring experts to attacks on human rights fact-finding in peace operations. So multilateral organisations like the UN have an increasing amount in common with the independent media and indeed with scientists. As independent arbiters of the truth, all of us potentially pose impediments to states' control over global narratives and discourses. As the great powers increasingly compete to establish narrative dominance in the information sphere, including through investments in artificial intelligence and the technologies I mentioned at the outset, these impediments that the UN, the media, and science impose to their power are becoming increasingly problematic. So in closing, ladies and gentlemen, I think the implications are obvious. Everyone stands to lose out if the global public goods of a free media, trusted scientific institutions, and independent international fact-finding mechanisms are destroyed. The time to stand up and defend those institutions, the tree of knowledge that bears facts as its fruits, that time is right now. This certainly means calling out leaders who incite or do violence of any kind against these institutions, and it means holding them accountable. But I also think it means thinking more deeply about how our market and regulatory structures in the market for information allocate responsibility for the social costs of peddling falsehood. Do we really want to continue immunizing online publishers from liability for the harms that the hate speech they traffic in causes? That is an invitation to continue externalizing the social costs of that misinformation. It's an approach that seems destined to positively encourage irresponsibility, irrationality, and unreason. Continue down that path, ladies and gentlemen, and we may soon conclude, like another tragic Shakespearean figure, Macbeth, that life's but a walking shadow, a poor player, that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Thank you very much.
My question to you is, and I agree with you that unless there is some sort of punitive outcome from the amount of misinformation that is in digital media, on social platforms, that it will continue, it will grow, it will become the norm as it is becoming now. How, though, does that trying to govern it, reel it in, work in the face of the First Amendment?
I'm not a First Amendment lawyer, but I am a recovering lawyer. So I would hazard to say that there are limits on the First Amendment. That is clear. The First Amendment is not a license to say anything in any context. And the First Amendment is exactly that, an amendment to a larger document. I don't know any constitutional lawyer, or any contract lawyer for that matter, who would read one clause not in the context of the broader document that it is part of. So it surely can't be the purpose of the First Amendment to undermine the effectiveness of the rest of the Constitution as a whole. So I think we'll find that that courts are quite willing to interpret existing jurisprudence in ways that limit the First Amendment. But I think the fundamental question is not just a constitutional one, it's a legislative and therefore a social one. that this is a question of everyone's responsibility for not only what they say, but for empowering systems that prevent us from knowing whether things that are said are true or not. It's very hard to have a meaningful First Amendment if you don't know if information put in front of you is actually true. And we're very, very close now to a system where you honestly don't know whether the material published in a newspaper, on the TV in the elevator that you get in the mornings, on your smartphone, you just don't know who created it. Was it created by an algorithm, a robot, a human, a combination of those? What's the underlying truth value of any particular statement? And as soon as we hit that period, and I think it is really upon us now, trust in those institutions is going to plummet. I think we really aren't quite sure what the effect of that Pandora's box is going to be, and we have to think very carefully about it. Now, the other thing I'd say on this is that it's not just about social media platforms. They are the business model that is currently most effectively exploiting all of these changes that we've talked about. But the reality is that that information is increasingly going to be spread through a whole range of devices and media, not just what we currently think of as social media platforms. But increasingly we see, for example, the car industry moving into becoming an information sharing platform. Think about what it will be like to sit in a car that you and your friends aren't driving. You're basically in a closed home theater for the next 2 hours. Advertisers will be all over that space. You won't be able to go 1 block in an automated vehicle without being bombarded with information and advertisements. So it's going to be a responsibility of car makers to think about the First Amendment. Who knew? Or refrigerator manufacturers. Many of you already have little screens embedded in your refrigerator. They also will be venues for displaying information to you. So yes, we're working this out right now in the context of social media platforms, but this is a much, much larger issue than that. Professor Pavlik?
Thank you. Excellent.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Fascinating comments. And the question of, how we would adjudicate what's a fact and what is truth, and to do it across borders and in any kind of a timely manner with such a crushing volume of data, and it's very daunting. But I want to ask you on a different perspective on it, because you mentioned a number of anniversaries that we have now, and there's one that I talked to my students about this year because it's the 80th anniversary of a very famous radio broadcast that was on October 30th. It was the play of The War of the Worlds, it was called, and a lot of listeners missed the opening few seconds, and so they didn't hear the disclaimer that it was just a radio play, and the show was done in a format that sounded like the radio of the day, and it was a new medium then, the way internet is sort of today. A lot of people didn't understand that it was a play, and a study that was done, they had some questions about it, but in any event, it showed that for a lot of people, they had a low level of what you might call critical ability. They didn't really have the skills to question the veracity of what they were listening to. And I wonder whether we're in kind of the same situation today, where a huge portion of the world's population, they don't really have the critical ability, the skills that they could learn to discriminate, because between truth and falsehood, or at least to know when to question something. You mentioned a few dimensions earlier. You said the source of a message, other characteristics of a message. So if the consumer, if the citizen can begin to learn more about what are the questionable traits, things to identify, and then be more skeptical themselves, so every citizen sort of becomes like a little scientist or a journalist in some fashion, to think critically and not just accept stuff that they see online, would that move us in a direction of at least a more intelligent population?
I certainly think, if I can master the technology, magic touch. I certainly think that's a fundamental aspect of the solution, but I'm not sure it's necessary, but I'm not sure it's sufficient. If I remember correctly, that broadcast begins with the famous words, "No one would have believed that we were being scrutinized by something or other Martians." Well, no one would have believed that we're being scrutinized today by algorithms. Everything we do right now online, nearly everything, is being studied. That's why I said we are increasingly dots on a canvas being scrutinized by algorithms. And the choices that they make are probabilistic. That's the fundamental nature of AI. It's probabilistic. It looks at how something you just did is likely to relate to patterns it understands, and then it makes a projection, a prediction about the probability of you liking something or you doing something. Now, I'm not a statistician. I consider myself reasonably well educated. I think I've got 4 degrees at the last count. I'm not a statistician, and my statistical literacy is frankly no real impediment to using these machines, these algorithmic solutions, nor frankly do I think it would be a great benefit to deciphering what they're telling me. So it at least awakens me rationally to what I am submitting myself to, and then allows me to critically engage with that process. But I'm also human and subject to emotion. And I was talking this morning with someone who was explaining how easy it is, even if you're critical of these systems, to be caught in the trap of clickbait. We're all emotional. We're all subject to affect. So it is a necessary part of the solution, but the systems themselves are slowly boiling us alive like frogs, so that the drumbeat of information poured on us, in which we're saturated in, is becoming more and more shocking, more and more inducing of emotional affect, more and more designed to move us away from rational, balanced engagement and towards emotional engagement. And I'm not sure how much scientific literacy will prevent that. It may slow it down, but if the system itself and the regulatory structures actually incentivize entrepreneurs and innovators to come up with new solutions that drag us in that direction, they will. So I don't think we can put all of the responsibility on the consumer. It's the system itself that is designed to work this way. This is not a bug. This is a feature of the media landscape as we know it.
Actually, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is this. What are the inherent characteristics of tech and social media that lead so many to accept things on face value, whereas in the past, oh yeah, we believed in Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather, but we also challenged what we read in books. We were much more quick to challenge what we read in books and what we read in research papers and did that research. So what is it? Is our schedules more crowded so we spend less time trying to research and prove things? Is it the fact that there's just an inherent way that this stuff catches us, like you said, with clickbait?
Well, I think I would contest the premise of the question. I'm not sure it's an inherent feature of the technology. I think it's an inherent feature of humanity. And I'm not sure we were faster to contest. I think the previous question is an excellent example of people taking something at face or ear value. They heard Orson Welles on the radio proclaiming the arrival of the Martian species, and they took it at face value. Equally, if you go back to the founding days of this country and look at how important pamphleteering was and the rumour mongering of the 1790s and the impact it had on early democracy here, there are huge parallels to fake news and what's going on today. And that is not a story that ended happily. That led to some real civil violence. So I think what is different now is the lowering of the barriers to the market for information and the ability to broadcast information. So it's not that our response time has changed, it's that we're dealing with a much vaster array of information. So before, if you were a merchant in a New England town receiving one of these pamphlets in the 1790s, you had time. You had an instant reaction, but you had time to reflect and to engage with the other merchants and your wife and your, I'm being very gendered in my perception of what a merchant was like in the 1790s, but that's probably how it was. You had time to reflect and to critically engage. but the speed with which we have to engage with information now because of the volume eradicates that. The speed with which you scroll through information on your Twitter feed, you're probably giving small decimal points of a second to each image that you pass across. You know, it is just fundamentally a different equation than how it was before.
I guess that's the last question, because we still have so many things to talk
Yes,
about.
I
You know,
want
the
to
other,
take much
the other sessions that we do have.
Thank you, and also I thank you for your presentation. It was really beneficial and it was really excellent. I just want to convey an example from. I am from the Middle East, and I know what the media has done to destabilize the regime, and the regime change. We have it in Tunisia, and the example in Tunisia, it is within 1 month the collapse of the regime. Also in Egypt, the role that media and the role that social media has played in terms of I don't want to say misleading, but yeah, relatively misleading the public opinion. Based on this, and also my personal skepticism is that it might be more catastrophes than the regime itself. I don't know what kind of catastrophe that those social media and media bring if it was misused. Is there any international thinking to channel or to have a control on the spread and on the flow of information? Is there any honor platform that media and social media that they have to adhere, like norms of honor or something like that? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, there you see the complexity and the flip side of this debate. That even as we discuss the risks of the democratization of information, it enables a response that suggests we should simply shut down discourse. Every year in the General Assembly, there is a resolution introduced under the heading Information Security. Now you can imagine how open to interpretation that phrase is, and how it is used by authoritarian states to argue that for all of the reasons I've just explained, we need a benevolent hand taking control of the information market and determining what is true, what is not, what is acceptable discourse, and what is not. So there are very live debates in different parts of the UN, in the General Assembly, in the Human Rights Council, in the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, that are essentially struggles between liberal and illiberal forces for governance of information. States recognize now, as I said in my remarks, that there is a very easy way to get at the will of the adversary. You don't have to go the indirect route of an army. You can simply directly interfere with the information to which the adversary's society is exposed. That is the strategic logic that underlay Russian interference in the United States elections, and that underlies many other states' interference with information flows in those countries. And I'm not saying this is a unidirectional thing at all. All states are recognizing the strategic logic of this approach. The problem is that if we use that discourse to shut down all exchange of information, all science, all free media, freedom of opinion, we will be living in a very illiberal world, and an illiberal world empowered by the very technologies that I was describing, with cameras and microphones everywhere, that is able to track your every move, to predict your move, and to base your life choices on those probabilistic determinations or predictions. Not the world of free will and free agency that I was privileged as a Western white man to grow up in. Not necessarily the world that some people constrained by circumstance already grow up into today, but a very different world than we live in, and a world with really troubling consequences. So for me, this is a fundamental question facing world order, the role that truth plays in our public policy making, in our international relations, and in our governance. And Professor Eckworth, thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak with all of you today, and I wish you all an extremely successful day of conversations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for my pleasure. Thank you so much.